January 9th, 1857. Just after 8 in the morning, the ground along a lonely stretch of central California near a town called Parkfield tears open. In the next few minutes, that tear races south, ripping through the crust at close to 2 miles per second, tracing a line more than 200 miles long through empty ranch land, over the mountains, past where a freeway will one day carry millions of cars a year. The rupture keeps going and going and going, for what today would be the entire drive from Los Angeles to well past the Grapevine and beyond. And then, right around a narrow mountain gap northeast of what is now San Bernardino, it stops. Just stops. Magnitude 7.9. One of the largest earthquakes in California's recorded history. And it ended precisely at a place called Cajun Pass, almost as if something there simply would not let it continue. For 165 years, that mountain gap has sat quietly, doing exactly what it did in 1857, acting as a wall. Scientists have just published new research suggesting that wall may not hold the way it used to. And if it doesn't, everything about what a major Southern California earthquake looks like changes. I want to walk you through this story a little differently than most earthquake coverage because the science here deserves more than a headline. We're going to start with what actually happened in 1857 and why it matters so much today, then walk step by step through what researchers just discovered about the ground underneath one of the most heavily populated corners of America. And finally, through what a very specific, very real earthquake scenario would actually look like if this junction lets go the way scientists now think it's capable of. This is not a disaster movie script. Every detail comes from the published research and from the scientists who did the work. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand a piece of California. Geology that almost nobody outside a handful of seismology labs has ever heard properly explained. If you're in Southern California right now, I want you to do something before we even get into the science. Think about the last time you drove Interstate 15 through the mountains north of San Bernardino on your way to Vegas or Big Bear or anywhere past the Cajun summit. Most people who make that drive have made it dozens of times without ever knowing they were passing directly over one of the most consequential few miles of ground in the entire country. Drop a comment and tell me if you knew what Cajun Pass actually was before today. And subscribe if you want to keep following this story, because the science here is moving fast and this is exactly the kind of slow-building research that tends to become urgent news with almost no warning at all. Let's go back to that gap in the mountains, because understanding why the 1857 rupture stopped there is the entire key to understanding what scientists just discovered. Southern California sits on top of two major, closely related fault systems. The San Andreas Fault, the one everybody has heard of, runs the length of the state and marks the boundary where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate are sliding past one another. Right alongside it runs the San Jacinto Fault, a separate structure that actually produces more earthquakes than the San Andreas does in raw frequency, even though it doesn't get nearly the same name recognition. For most of their length, these two faults behave independently, but at Cajun Pass, the geometry of the crust brings them close enough together that a rupture tearing along one fault can, under the right conditions, physically jump across and continue tearing along the other. Think of it like two long cracks in a sidewalk that happen to intersect at one specific point. Sometimes, a crack traveling down one line hits that intersection and simply stops, because the stress on the other side of the junction isn't primed to continue the break. Other times, the crack sails straight through the intersection and keeps growing along the second line, turning what would have been a short crack into a much longer one. Scientists studying Cajun Pass have started calling this exact junction an earthquake gate, because it can behave either way depending on conditions that, until very recently, nobody had actually managed to measure with any precision. That's exactly what a team led by geophysicist Liliane Burkhardt, working across the University of Bern in Switzerland and the University of Hawaii at Manoa, alongside researchers from the UIOMS Geological Survey's Earthquake Science Center and Scripps Institution of Oceanography, set out to figure out. Instead of just looking at how much stress has built up on each fault individually, which scientists have understood in broad strokes for decades, they built a physics-based model reconstructing an entire 1,000 years of earthquake history across both fault systems, feeding it detailed paleoseismic evidence, physical traces of ancient earthquakes preserved underground and pulled from 31 separate survey sites to track precisely how stress has accumulated, released, and shifted around this junction over the past millennium. Here's what they found. And this is the number that changes everything about how we should think about this stretch of California. When they went back through 1,000 years of reconstructed earthquake history and looked specifically at the moments when ruptures successfully crossed through Cajun Pass, jumping from one fault onto the other the way scientists now worry could happen again, a clear pattern emerged. Those crossings tended to happen when the stress difference between the two fault segments feeding into the junction was small, around 0, 3 megapascals. When the two sides were roughly evenly loaded, the gate swung open. When one side carried dramatically more stress than the other, the gate tended to hold, stopping the rupture the way it did in 1857. Today, that stress difference sits at roughly 0, 8 megapascals, which on the surface might sound like good news. But here's the detail that should actually grab your attention, and it's the same detail that had Burkhardt staring at her screen when the simulation finished running. One specific segment feeding into this junction, the San Bernardino portion of the San Jacinto Fault, is now registering a stress load of 3, 6 megapascals in the model. That is not just a high number in the abstract. It is the single highest reading found anywhere across the entire 1,000-year reconstruction. And it surpasses a level that same segment last reached roughly 50 years ago. One whole side of this gate is holding more built-up tectonic pressure than at any point researchers could measure going back a full millennium. As Burkhardt put it herself, the pattern in the data shows that earthquakes crossed this junction in the past, specifically when both sides carried similarly high stress, and that is the configuration the region is now approaching. Now let's talk about why this matters in a way that goes beyond a number on a chart. Because this is where I want to walk you through what an earthquake gate opening would actually mean for the people living above it. The research team explicitly modeled this scenario, and their findings put a joint rupture crossing Cajon Pass, tearing through both the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems together in the magnitude 7, 4 to 7, 8 range. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same category of earthquake, in terms of sheer energy release, as the one that just devastated Venezuela this past year, or the earthquake that struck Japan's Sanriku coast in April. Both events that made global headlines for very different reasons, depending entirely on how prepared the ground beneath them was. Picture it happening on an ordinary Tuesday morning, rush hour on Interstate 15 through Cajon Pass, one of the busiest mountain corridors in the country. The rupture starts, as researchers now think is increasingly plausible, on one of the 2 fault segments feeding into the junction, and instead of stopping the way it did in 1857, it crosses. What would have been a serious but geographically contained earthquake instead keeps growing, extending its reach across 2 fault systems at once. The shaking wouldn't stay confined to one narrow corridor. It would hit the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley essentially simultaneously, an area home to well over 10 million people going about an entirely ordinary day. The damage in a scenario like that wouldn't come only from the shaking itself, it would come from what the shaking does to infrastructure built long before anyone had this level of detail about the ground underneath it. Large sections of the Los Angeles Basin sit on soil, particularly areas built on old river sediment or reclaimed land, that is known to amplify seismic waves dramatically, meaning 2 neighborhoods just a few miles apart could experience wildly different intensities of shaking, depending entirely on what kind of ground they happen to be sitting on. Thousands of older apartment buildings across the region, constructed in the 1960s and 70s with open, unreinforced ground floors for parking, sit in exactly the category of structure that has historically proven most vulnerable to collapse during strong lateral shaking, a pattern engineers have documented and warned about for years, but that retrofitting efforts have been slow to fully address. Then there's what happens underground, quite literally. Gas mains, water pipelines, and electrical transmission lines crisscross this entire region, many of them running directly across or near the very fault traces this study examined. A major joint rupture would almost certainly rupture some of these lines, and broken gas mains, combined with damaged water infrastructure, create one of the most dangerous compounding effects in any major earthquake. Fires that break out from broken gas lines at the same moment that firefighters lose the water pressure they need to fight them. Add severed freeways and rail corridors, arteries this region depends on every single day for both commerce and emergency response. And hospital systems that could be simultaneously damaged and overwhelmed at the exact moment their services become most critical, and you start to understand why researchers didn't file this finding away as an academic curiosity. This is exactly why lead researcher Burkhardt has been so direct in her message to policymakers and emergency planners, urging them to treat a joint rupture across both fault systems as a realistic planning scenario rather than a remote, worst-case hypothetical reserved for disaster films. Geophysicist Ross Stein, writing about this research, framed the broader context. Well, more than 165 years have passed since the great 1857 rupture, and across that entire span, tectonic forces have kept loading both the San Andreas and the San Jacinto Fault in the Cajon Pass area, with this new study suggesting that accumulated loading has now pushed the junction to one of its highest stress levels in at least 1,000 years. And fellow researcher Jacob Weingarten, whose work also focuses on modeling stress and triggering along the San Andreas, put his finger on exactly what makes this discovery different from decades of prior earthquake research. It's not simply that stress builds up over time. Everyone in this field has understood that basic fact for a long time. What's new is the realization that the balance of stress specifically across this junction may be what decides whether the next major earthquake here stays contained on one fault, the way 1857 did, or grows into something far larger and far more complex. I want to be genuinely careful here, because it would be easy to take a story like this and turn it into fear for its own sake, and that's not what good science reporting should do. This research does not predict a date. No scientific method that exists today can tell you when this specific earthquake will happen. Not this year, not next year, not within any specific window anyone could responsibly put a number on. And what this research does is something scientifically far more valuable for long-term planning. It identifies a precise, measurable physical condition, the stress balance across a very specific, geographically pinpointed junction, and shows, with published peer-reviewed data, that this condition now closely resembles the setup present before some of the region's largest historical earthquakes. Burkhardt herself has been explicit that her goal with this research isn't to spark panic. It's to convey genuine urgency to the people whose decisions, right now, today, determine how ready this region actually is when the ground finally does move. There's also something worth appreciating about the way this research was done, because it represents a real shift in how scientists think about earthquake hazard generally. Instead of treating each fault as an isolated system, studied and modeled on its own, this team built a tool specifically designed to understand how neighboring faults interact at the exact points where they meet. And they've made clear that the same physics-based approach used here at Cajun Pass could, in principle, be applied to other dangerous fault junctions around the world where scientists have long wondered whether a rupture on one structure could cross onto a neighboring one. As Burkhardt put it, the underlying purpose is using rigorous quantitative science to better understand the risk facing millions of people, a purpose that extends well beyond this one mountain pass in San Bernardino County. So let's come back to that image from 1857 one more time, because it's the clearest way to understand exactly what's at stake in this research. For 165 years, Cajun Pass has behaved like a wall, stopping a rupture that had already torn through 200 miles of California before it ever got there. That wall wasn't magic. It was a specific physical condition, mismatch in stress between two fault segments, that happened to exist at that exact moment in 1857 and kept the earthquake from spreading further than it did. The unsettling part of this new research is that the same physics that built that wall can, under a different and now increasingly likely configuration, turn it into an open gate instead. And the data suggests Southern California is closer to that second configuration than researchers have been able to measure at any point across an entire 1,000 years of reconstructed history. None of this changes what actually protects people when the ground does move, and that part of the story hasn't changed at all. Know where your gas shutoff valve is and how to use it. Secure your water heater and bolt heavy furniture to the wall. Keep several days of water, food, and any necessary medication on hand, because emergency response networks in a major, multi-county earthquake will be stretched thin exactly when you need them most. Have a plan for reaching your family when mobile networks go down, because in a major earthquake they generally do, at least for a while. Know your evacuation routes before you need them, not after. None of this takes more than an afternoon of your time, and every one of these small, unglamorous steps is precisely what separates weathering a major earthquake from becoming a casualty of one. We don't know when Cajun Pass will decide whether it's a wall or a gate the next time a rupture reaches it. Nobody honestly working in this field will pretend they do. But for the first time, scientists have actually measured the specific condition that seems to make that decision. And right now, that measurement is pointing in a direction that has researchers using words like critically stressed rather than words like routine. That's worth understanding clearly, and it's worth acting on quietly and steadily, the same way people in truly earthquake-ready places around the world already do. If walking through the science this way was useful to you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes out of this fault system next, because research like this has a way of sitting quietly for months and then suddenly becoming the only story anyone's talking about. Tell me in the comments if you live along either of these fault lines and whether this changes how seriously you're taking your own preparedness. Stay informed, stay ready, and I'll see you in the next one.